Two soldiers dropped, bullets in their backs, a mile from safety. Fort Pitt, 1763. A lone outpost in a sea of rage. The Delaware and Shawnee weren't just attacking, they were dismantling an empire, one ambush at a time. Fort Pitt stood like a lonely sentinel in 1763, perched where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers merge into the mighty Ohio. Built in 1759 by General Stanwix on the ashes of Fort Duquesne, it wasn't just a fort, it was a chokehold on the frontier. Its position screamed military dominance, controlling access to the vast interior. Aesthetically, the rivers framed it like a grim painting, but strategically, it was a linchpin in a world unraveling. Picture a colonial chessboard. Fort Pitt was the king, and everyone wanted it captured. The fort's earthen walls, brick-faced toward the Ohio, loomed over a wilderness that didn't care for British ambition. 200 miles east, the nearest settlements huddled, separated by the Allegheny's jagged spine and dense forests. Two roads, Braddock's from 1755, Forbes from 1758, snaked through Carlisle and Bedford, brittle lifelines to civilization. Fort Pitt wasn't just isolated. It was a speck in a sea of trees, surrounded by whispers of unrest. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks, and the garrison knew it. By May 1763, those whispers turned to shouts. On May 4, Captain Simeon Ecure, Fort Pitt's commander, got a letter from Major Gladwin. The news was grim. Curs were circling, particularly the Delaware and Shawnee. Ecure's men, already on edge, felt the noose tightening. Then, at dusk on May 27, a group of native traders arrived, their pack horses laden with furs. They bartered for bullets, axes, and gunpowder. But their demeanor, too calm, too calculated, set off alarms. Ecure's gut churned. These weren't merchants, they were scouts. Hours later, word came. Colonel Clapham and others had been slaughtered and scalped nearby. A nearby native village stood empty, abandoned like a stage cleared for war. The next day, violence erupted. Two soldiers were gunned down within a mile of the fort's walls. A trader named Calhoun stumbled in from Tuscaroras, pale and shaking. He'd met Shingas, a Delaware chief, who warned him to flee. Shingas claimed the Ottawa and Ojibwa had seized Detroit, Sandusky, every inland fort. Worse, the Delaware and Shawnee were hunting traders like wolves. Calhoun's group of 14 was disarmed and led to Beaver Creek's mouth, straight into an ambush. 11 died in a hail of bullets. Calhoun and two others barely escaped, crawling through the underbrush. Ecure scribbled a frantic letter to Colonel Bouquet, his words dripping with dread. The affair is general. He feared for his outposts, certain the fort was surrounded. Attack was imminent, he wrote, likely at dawn. The frontier was hemorrhaging. Reports flooded in. Over 100 traders dead. Their goods plundered in a frenzy of destruction. One survivor owed his life to playing mad, gibbering nonsense while his captors laughed. Deception was everywhere, promises of safe passage turned into bloodbaths. Fort Ligonier and Bedford, too, were under fire, their garrisons scrambling to hold the line. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was a coordinated uprising, later called Pontiac's War. Fort Pitt, a symbol of British overreach, was a prime target. The Delaware and Shawnee weren't just fighting for scalps, they were pushing back against a tide of settlers and forts carving up their world. Ecure's men, outnumbered and cut off, could feel the forest closing in. Every rustle in the trees was a threat. Every shadow a warrior. The fort's walls were strong, but the wilderness was stronger, and it was awake. Think of Fort Pitt in 1763 as a colonial version of a reality show gone wrong, except the stakes weren't votes or fame, but survival. The garrison, a mix of soldiers, traders, and woodsmen, braced for what was coming. They didn't know the full scale of the native coalition forming, but they felt its weight. The Alleghenies loomed like a jury, and the rivers carried warnings. Fort Pitt wasn't just a fort, it was a stage for a brutal drama, and the curtain was rising. June 1763 turned Fort Pitt into a pressure cooker. Captain Simeon Ecure, commanding a garrison of 330 soldiers, traders, and woodsmen, ordered every cabin outside the walls razed. No cover for the enemy. Each dawn, an hour before sunrise, drums rolled, and men scrambled to battle stations. The fort, swollen with 100 women and countless children, felt like a tinderbox. Smallpox had already crept in, forcing Ecure to carve out a hospital beneath the drawbridge. Overcrowding wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a death sentence waiting to ignite. The forest around Fort Pitt pulsed with menace. Young native warriors, eager for their first scalps, prowled like wolves. Day and night, shots cracked at sentries. Venturing beyond the walls was suicide. Every man who tried was shot, scalped, and left as a warning. The woods teemed with unseen enemies, their numbers growing daily. No full assault yet, but the air was thick with anticipation. Ecure's men gripped their muskets, scanning the trees, knowing each rustle could be their last. On the afternoon of the 22nd of June, the storm broke. Native warriors emerged at the clearing's edge, driving off horses and slaughtering cattle. Then, a barrage erupted from all sides. Bullets whined. But the range was long, only 2 defenders fell. Ecure's men answered with howitzers, shells bursting among the attackers. The explosions stunned the warriors, scattering them in confusion. As night fell, the gunfire dwindled, but sporadic shots and chilling war cries echoed through the darkness, keeping sleep at bay. At 9 p.m., a Delaware named Turtle's Heart approached under a flag of truce, claiming friendship. His words were grim. 6 major tribes had taken up the war axe, wiping out every British post except Fort Pitt. He urged Ecure to flee with the women and children to eastern settlements, promising safe passage. But he warned, when the tribe's full force arrived, no one would be spared. It was a plea, wrapped in a threat, delivered with the calm of a man holding a knife. Ecure didn't blink. He dismissed Turtle's Heart, boasting Fort Pitt had warriors, food, and ammunition to hold out 3 years against any native assault. "This is our home," he declared, "and you've attacked us without cause." Then came his masterstroke, what history calls his political invention. Ecure spun a tale of 3 massive British armies, 6,000 men marching to Fort Pitt, 3,000 to crush the Ottawa and Ojibwa, and a third, bolstered by Cherokee and Catawba allies, to devastate native lands from Virginia. He warned the warriors to go home, or he'd rain grenades and cannon fire, blowing you to pieces. This wasn't just bravado, it was psychological warfare. Ecure's bluff landed like a grenade itself. The Delaware, shaken, began to doubt their odds. By the next day, most had vanished, retreating west to link up with a larger war party. Ecure's gamble bought time, but not peace. The fort stood firm, but the horizon darkened with the promise of a greater storm. His men, exhausted but unbroken, reloaded their muskets, knowing the real fight was coming. Think of Ecure's stand as a high-stakes poker game in 1763's wilderness. He held a weak hand, 330 men, a smallpox outbreak, and a forest full of enemies, but played it like a king. The Delaware's truce offer was a trap disguised as mercy, and Ecure saw through it. His defiance, laced with dark humor and a fabricated army, turned the tables. Fort Pitt wasn't just a fort anymore, it was a symbol of resistance, teetering on the edge of annihilation. By late June 1763, Fort Pitt was a lone beacon in a collapsing frontier. News from the western outpost trickled in, each report more gut-wrenching than the last. On the 26th of July, a soldier named Gray staggered into the fort from Presqu'île, his eyes hollow. He claimed over 200 native warriors from Detroit had besieged his post for 3 days, torching it, digging tunnels, and forcing a surrender. Gray swore the garrison was massacred, save for him and one other. Later accounts corrected his tale. The soldiers were spared, marched to Detroit, some even adopted by native families. Truth was a casualty in the fog of war. Gray's report didn't stop there. He brought word of Detroit's plight, besieged for 6 weeks by hundreds of warriors. A relief party of 96 men had been ambushed nearby. Only 30 crawled back. The rest killed or tortured slowly. Gray also speculated that Forts Le Boeuf and Venango were gone, their garrisons miserably perished. His words painted a frontier in flames, with Fort Pitt as the last domino standing. Ecure's men listened, their faces grim, knowing their own walls might be next. That same day, Ensign Price limped into Fort Pitt with 7 exhausted soldiers, their story even bleaker. Price commanded Le Boeuf, a flimsy blockhouse with 2 corporals, 11 privates, 20 bullets per man, and spoiled gunpowder. On the 18th of June, 5 natives were admitted under a guise of friendship, leaving weapons outside. Then 30 more arrived, demanding entry. When refused, they breached a nearby storehouse, burrowing into its cellar and firing from cover, untouchable by the blockhouse's loopholes. Flaming arrows set the structure ablaze 3 times. Each time, Price's men doused the flames. The fourth fire roared beyond control. Price wanted to fight to the death, "We'll die together," but relented, letting his men slip through a rear window into the night. Price's group stumbled through swamps, watching the sky glow red behind them as LeBoeuf burned. Gunfire echoed. The natives celebrated. By dawn, they'd barely covered 2 miles, lost in the dark. Starving, with 3 biscuits each, they reached Venango at 1 a.m. the next day. It was a smoldering ruin, charred bodies scattered among the ashes. A Seneca warrior later recounted Venango's fall. They entered as friends, sealed the gates, and slaughtered all but the commander, Lieutenant Gordon. He was forced to write a manifesto justifying the native war, then tortured over slow fires for nights until death. The fort was razed. The wider frontier bled. Fort Ligonier endured relentless assaults but held firm. Fort Augusta on the Susquehanna was spared when reinforcements arrived, scattering the attackers. Carlisle, Bedford, and smaller posts faced savage hostility. While scattered settlements suffered atrocities beyond description, families butchered, homes burned, the native coalition, fueled by resentment of British forts and settlers, was dismantling the colonial edge. Fort Pitt's garrison, hearing these tales, felt the noose tighten. Their world was shrinking, and the forest was winning. Ecure's men absorbed these stories like a punch to the gut. Each fallen outpost was a warning. No one was coming to save them. Price's escape, Gray's survival, these were miracles, not plans. The frontier wasn't just a battlefield, it was a graveyard for British ambition. Fort Pitt stood as a defiant middle finger to the uprising, but defiance alone wouldn't stop the axes falling in the night. The garrison reloaded, watched the trees, and waited for the inevitable. Think of this as 1763's version of a horror movie, where every outpost was a doomed cabin in the woods. Fort Pitt's men weren't just fighting for survival, they were staring down a rebellion that wanted their world erased. The stories of LeBoeuf and Venango weren't just news, they were omens. Ecure's fort, packed with soldiers, traders, women, and children, was a pressure cooker, and the heat was rising. July 1763 saw Fort Pitt harden into a fortress of desperation. The spring floods had chewed at the walls, so Ecure's men labored to patch them with dirt and sweat. Palisades rose along the ramparts, barracks were proofed against bullets to shield women and children, and a crude fire engine was rigged to combat flaming arrows. For weeks, all ties to the east severed. No messengers slipped through the native net. The garrison was an island in a sea of hostility, every supply rationed, every eye on the tree line. Sporadic attacks dotted the month, petty but persistent, like needles pricking a giant. Native warriors tested the defenses, their shots harmless, but their intent clear as a drawn tomahawk. No major damage. Yet the psychological toll mounted. Ecure's soldiers slept in shifts, muskets at hand, while smallpox festered in the shadows. The fort's overcrowding turned air thick with fear and fever, a reminder that enemies lurked inside the walls too. On the 26th of July, native leaders, including Shingas and Turtle's Heart, approached under a flag. They lamented broken alliances, accusing the British of planting forts on native soil like weeds. Word came of Ottawa reinforcements marching through, a massive force set to devour everything in its path. They begged the garrison to evacuate, promising safety. It was the same ploy as before, dressed in fresh words, but the stakes felt higher now, with the frontier's other posts in ashes. Ecure stood firm, refusing to budge. He echoed his earlier boast, enough men, food, and powder for 3 years against any native horde. He mocked the Ottawa, expressed shock at the Delaware's audacity, and repeated his threats of grenades, shattering bodies, and cannons spewing grapeshot. His words were a wall of their own, unyielding and laced with contempt. The council dissolved without agreement, the air heavier than before. Frustrated, the natives unleashed their full wrath. That night, warriors swarmed close, digging pits under riverbanks with knives, shielded from return fire. Dawn brought a relentless fusillade from all directions, bullets peppering the fort for days on end. War cries pierced the chaos, women and children huddled in terror amid the din. Yet the defenses held. Soldiers fired back from behind logs, their aim steady and lethal. Ecure prowled the ramparts, his broken English rallying the men, a minor arrow wound in his leg drawing only a curse. Flaming arrows arced overhead but fizzled harmlessly. By the 2nd of August, Ecure reported to his colonel, 5 days and nights of non-stop assault, no deaths. 7 wounded, including himself lightly. He claimed 20 native casualties visible, more unseen, boasting no warrior could show his face without catching lead. On the 3rd of August, the siege lifted. The natives broke camp and melted away, leaving silence in their wake. Ecure's garrison exhaled, battered but intact. The prolonged ordeal had tested every nerve, turning a remote outpost into a symbol of stubborn endurance. The forest fell quiet, but the uprising's echoes lingered, a promise of more blood to come. Fort Pitt's July siege was like a colonial staring contest with death. Ecure's defiance, repeated like a mantra, bought survival through sheer will. The natives' tactics, clever and unyielding, exposed British vulnerability in a land that wasn't theirs to claim. The fort held, but at what cost? Lives spared today meant grudges nursed for tomorrow. The siege ended not with a bang, but a vanishing act. Ecure's bluffs and bullets held Fort Pitt, turning a native uprising into a stalemate soaked in resentment. History remembers Pontiac's war as a flash of resistance, but for those inside the walls, it was a grinding lesson in isolation and endurance. Subscribe to Histories and Native Tales. Hit like if this gripped you, and comment your thoughts below.